James Allen has collected a photographic record of racial violence in the South. For the past 20 years, he's found horrifying pictures in the family albums of ordinary Southern homes. Many are postcards that were mass-produced as souvenirs.
Some of these images were printed in the tens of thousands and sold for a dime or $1 a piece. Some of the postcards tell you where to write and the discounts you'll get if you buy 1, 10, or 100. They were sold in drugstores and pharmacies. They were sold on the street. I purchased a photograph from a woman. The photographer sold them door to door. Her mother bought the image for $2.
A new report on the history of lynchings in the United States and their legacy today. After 5 years of exhaustive research and interviews with local historians and descendants of lynching victims, the Equal Justice Initiative found white Southerners lynched nearly 4,000 black men and women and children between 1877 and 1950. Nearly 700 of those lynchings were previously unaccounted for. The report details a 1916 attack in which a mob lynched Jeff Brown for accidentally bumping into a white girl as he ran to catch a train. In an example from 1940, a crowd lynched Jesse Thornton for not addressing a white police officer as Mr. In many cases, the lynchings were attended by the entire white community in an area.
This rhetoric of states' rights was precisely what local states asserted when the federal government began asking questions about why these lynchings were being tolerated. And in many ways, it is that dynamic that set up this era of terrorism. I mean, at the end of the Civil War, you had people who were reclaiming power from freed black people. It's really at the beginning of the end of Reconstruction that we see violence and threats and intimidation beginning to assert itself to sustain racial hierarchy. White supremacy wouldn't succeed if it wasn't enforced with violence and threat and terror.
A murder that is of particular interest to me was of a 17-year-old boy by the name of Jess Washington in Waco, Texas, in 1916. He was seriously mentally challenged. The wife of the farmer that he worked for was found dead. He was arrested. He was brought to trial. The trial took from 10 until 12. And when the jury came back at noon and found him guilty, someone in the courtroom, and it would have been anyone in the courtroom, screamed out, "Get that girl." Then one of the worst and cruelest treatments of a human being began. Jess was kicked down out of the courthouse, down the back steps where a crowd of several hundred was waiting for him. They put a chain on his neck. There were 16,000 people crowding the street to watch this boy be tortured. Jess was tied to the chain over a branch of a tree. The fire was started. They raised Jess from the fire up into the air so that the crowd could see him. There were cheers, like at a football game, cheering the torturers on. When Jess tried to climb up the chains, hand by hand, they cut his fingers off one by one, so that all he could do was slap at the chain. They lowered him back down in the fire. A man came up and castrated him. Another man kept a pole so that he couldn't crawl out of the fire. And time and again, they pulled him up to keep him from dying so that the crowd could be satisfied, until he finally died.
And at the very beginning, African Americans were asking the federal government to intervene. They didn't when thousands of African Americans were being lynched and menaced and threatened and terrorized with no protection and with tolerance from both state and federal officials. I mean, lynching it became a really social phenomenon, and it became quite intoxicating when people got this power to just abduct folks and to torture them and engage in this carnival-like atmosphere. They became, for want of a better word, bloodthirsty. And you see some of these counties where you have a lynching and then that's followed by 2 or 3 more in a very short period of time. And what was so traumatizing to people of color is that all people of color were the intended targets and victims of these lynchings. This was not an act assigned to someone for committing a crime. As you've described, oftentimes people were being lynched for no criminal accusation at all. Jesse Thornton was an African-American man in Laverne, Alabama, and in 1940, which is really toward the end of the lynching era, he addressed a police officer by his name. He didn't use the title Mr., and that was considered such a violation of the racial norms and values that the officer organized a mob and they lynched him. In Blakely, Georgia, an African-American man, William Little, came home from World War I wearing his uniform, and people were offended, annoyed that he had on this American uniform, and he was lynched because he refused to take it off. A black man running to catch a train bumps into a white girl. He's lynched for that incident. This violence, this terror, was really aimed at sustaining racial hierarchy, keeping black people in their place. And in many ways, it was quite intoxicating. You could see whole communities getting involved in these acts of violence and really being quite grotesque about the way they carried them out.
But hanging was preferred because it lifted these bodies up to terrorize and taunt communities of color.
Some people even brought children and picnic baskets to these brutal murders. Others took photographs of the victims, using them to produce lynching postcards. With law enforcement so often negligent in the face of lynch mobs, it took a revolution in public opinion to bring an end to lynchings as a public spectacle.
These public spectacle lynchings that we document in our report are horrific. 10,000 people showed up in Paris, Texas, in a carnival-like atmosphere to watch a man be tortured. Some of these executions, we have one in Dyersburg, Tennessee, where the man had his eyes gouged out. He was burned, he was mutilated, and thousands of people witnessed this.
And Brian Stevenson, while your report concentrated on the southern states, and obviously lynching was most intensely practiced against the African-American community, it was also widely practiced against in the old Mexican territories that were the United States, like Texas and New Mexico, Arizona. I've seen one report where as many as 600 Mexicans were lynched between 1848 and 1928 in the Southwest.
And you're absolutely right. In our full report, we actually talk about the lynchings of Mexicans and Mexican Americans. And they had many of the features that are evident in the lynchings of African Americans. They weren't being lynched for accusations of crime necessarily. There were Mexicans that were lynched for speaking Spanish in settings where people didn't want to hear Spanish. And you're absolutely right. In the border states in particular, this phenomena of lynching directed at Mexicans and Mexican Americans was a very real threat. You go to Germany now and you are forced to deal with the legacy of the Holocaust because there are markers and monuments everywhere. We do the opposite in this country. We celebrate the things, in my judgment, that we probably shouldn't be celebrating. In all of these states, you find Confederate memorials and monuments everywhere dedicated to the people who were defending slavery, trying to preserve slavery, and yet nothing about the pain and anguish and suffering and injustice that those institutions created. A man in Aberdeen, Mississippi knocked on someone's door on the front, and then he was chased and ultimately lynched because he didn't go to the back of the door, which is where people of color were expected to go. And about 20% of these 4,000 lynchings were lynchings for basically social transgressions. Many African-American men were lynched because they had notes or letters to young white women. And oftentimes, people would be lynched for accusations of rape or murder when 2 or 3 days later, the alleged murder victim would show up in town saying, no, I was just gone for 2 or 3 days. Or the rape victim would say, I was never the victim of a sexual assault. And this hysteria was deeply, deeply disruptive to people of color. One of the things that we discovered that I was particularly moved by were people who told us that they sent thousands of people away, their relatives, their friends, because they'd have an encounter with somebody in town and they thought the encounter might have been misinterpreted and they feared the mob might show up, and so they would send their dad or their child or their sister or their sibling to the north because they feared what they called a near lynching. Nobody talks about this racial history, but they celebrate the, quote, good old days of the early 20th century.